So, get started. Lassen uns beginnen. Bevor wir starten, möchte ich Sie darauf hinweisen,
Before we begin, let me point out that we offer a simultaneous German-English translation. By clicking on the globe at the bottom of the screen, you can choose your preferred language and listen to the translation.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, we would like to point out that we offer simultaneous German-English translation. By clicking on the globe at the bottom of the screen, you can choose your preferred language and hear the translation. Meine Damen und Herren, ich freue mich sehr, Sie zu unserem Panel. Wer einen Schritt zurück
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to our panel. Whoever takes a step back sees the whole picture, a historical experience of crisis. My name is Andreas Edel. I'm the head of the Max Planck Society's network of now 39 demographic research institutes from all over Europe. I have the honor to facilitate the panel today. I'm particularly pleased that we have succeeded in bringing together such an expert panel with Reid, professor at the University of Cambridge, Sigrid Weigel, former director of the Leibniz Center for Literary and Cultural Research in Berlin, and Jürgen, Renn, founding director of the Max Planck Institute for Geoanthropology in Jena. I will introduce you to the participants in more detail later on, but unfortunately I have to announce in advance that Professor Rita Süssmuth has had to cancel at short notice for health reasons. This is, of course, highly regrettable, as her clever and courageous educational policy in the 1980s following the outbreak of the AIDS pandemic can be seen as exemplary in many respects. Of course, we send her our best wishes for a speedy recovery. But let me start by looking back at the crisis we have just gone through, even if it is probably not yet historic in the sense of having been overcome, the COVID-19 pandemic. It was an almost traumatic experience for many people. Virtually overnight, a virus whose danger and transmission routes were initially not understood and against which people could only defend themselves by isolating themselves, literally to control of their own lives, and this extended into the most private areas of life. Some did not even dare to touch a door handle because there was could be something invisible on it. In addition, there were images of mass graves which symbolized the feeling of helplessness. Only the spread of vaccines and the wearing of masks conveyed a sense of protection. This subcutaneous fear of threat and the widespread insecurity among the population provided, of course, also an ideal breeding ground for conspiracy theorists and political free riders who pursued their own interests by stoking fears and reservations. Added to this was the consistent denial and downplaying of the fact that we were really dealing with a fundamental crisis. At the moment, we still cannot fully assess the mental, social, and political consequences of this crisis. Many even speak of a COVID generation with a view to younger people, for whom the outbreak of the pandemic and the lockdowns may have been a life-changing event. So this is the crisis scenario we're working from today. If we go back from generation to generation, however, this is of course not the only human experience of this kind. Just think of the Spanish flu that struck our grandparents and great-grandparents and which, like COVID, only lasted a few years. According to WHO estimates, however, it claimed around 20 to 50 million lives worldwide. So probably twice as many deaths as COVID so far. And if we go back even further, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history was associated with the spread of plague viruses. These outbreaks occurred in waves over several centuries and repeatedly claimed countless lives. Even back then, quarantine and lockdowns were the means of choice to combat such pandemics. Despite this, an estimated 70,000 people died in London alone in just a few months of 1 year, namely in 1665 during the so-called Great Plague. However, the plague virus, which spread throughout Europe at the time, also led to a more intensive examination of mortality issues and triggered a major innovation, which incidentally also indirectly gave our current event its name. Demography and epidemiology as scientific disciplines were founded in London in the mid-17th century, and the plague waves played a key role in this. This is also part of parcel of crises. They can provide impetus and initiate changes that extend into the realms of science and cultural life, or conversely, trigger counter movements that prevent structural changes. We will come back to this later, maybe. I'm delighted to have the chance to welcome 3 experts to our panel today, with whom I can examine various facets of historical experiences of crisis. In a way, the question, what can we learn from the history of humanity's crises? Of course, we cannot address all the crises of the past. We're more interested in using a few examples to understand how crises are experienced and where crisis management could be applied from a political perspective. I will now switch to English.
Reid is a professor of demography and director of the prestigious Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure and fellow of the Churchill College in Cambridge. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Alice. Her research focuses on fertility, mortality, and health mainly in the late 19th and in the early 20th centuries. In addition to a wide range of topics in historical demography, she's worked on infant and child mortality, the Spanish flu, and regional disparities in mortality. Alice, in 2021, our colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research and other institutes described the so-called mortality crisis of the 17th century using data on the lives of scholars in Germany to understand how and when mortality declined. But this was actually a fairly privileged social group. Early demographers actually understood already that infant and child mortality was one of the drivers of population decline. And in your research on the Spanish flu, you also pointed out that a lot of attention has been paid to mortality in the age group of 20 to 40, but much less to infant and child mortality. Isn't infant mortality the much more prominent driver of mortality crisis that not only affects the population as a whole, but also creates traumatic experiences for mothers, fathers, and other individuals in a family? And what can we do about that? You have to open your
Sorry,
yeah.
Thanks very much for inviting me first, and for your really interesting question. There are lots of different things in here to unpack. So I think first of all, I want to say that a death in a family is always a traumatic event. Some people have thought or suggested that because infant and child death was much more common in the past, that parents didn't feel it as deeply. We don't really have much evidence or much really hard evidence about that. We can't really compare degrees of emotional suffering between the past and present, but the evidence that we do have from diaries, literature, and so on indicates that infant and child death was certainly a traumatic event in the past. But that doesn't mean that it was a crisis, and it was a crisis for individual families, but perhaps not as much as the death of someone in the working age group, because that would have had a knock-on effect on livelihoods and so on as well. Infant mortality was a really big part of mortality levels. In much of the time before about the late 19th century, many places in Europe had about 1 or 2 out of every 10 infants born who died before the age of 1. And this constitutes an awful lot of mortality, a big mortality burden, and an awful lot of potential life years lost. So it's absolutely true to say that when infant mortality when infant mortality declined and fewer children died, it had a really big impact on life expectancy at birth and on mortality levels. So infant mortality was a prominent driver of life expectancy and a much bigger driver than mortality during adulthood. So infant mortality was very traumatic for families, a crisis for individual families, a big driver of mortality levels and trends, but I'm not sure that makes it a big driver of mortality crises. And that's because I think the notion of a crisis suggests something really unusual and temporary for society. Lots of crises for individual families don't necessarily add up to a crisis for society. And I think infant mortality tended to be fairly uniformly high. So when there was a crisis, it was less likely to be a crisis in infant mortality. It was a rise in death rates among other ages, or among infants and other ages, which formed crises. So there were periodic crises which were produced by things like epidemics and pandemics, by climatic factors and man-made famines as well, and by wars and so on. And we've talked a lot about epidemics and pandemics today, and some of these included, as you've mentioned, plague, influenza, cholera, and smallpox. And you've already mentioned that plague had a really big historical impact, with the Black Death killing some estimates as low as a third, other estimates as high as a half or more of Europe's population over a 6-year period. And this returned repeatedly until about 1700, increasing annual deaths by as much as 5 times normal numbers. So an excess mortality rate, and we've all, over the COVID pandemic, become used to this term of excess mortality. So an excess mortality rate of about 500%. And other epidemics after plague died out in the late 18th century, late 17th and the 18th century, other epidemics increased mortality by up to about 200%. So crisis mortality really died out over those centuries. I just want to contrast that, those sorts of crises with, you mentioned the 19 influenza pandemic, which is the largest recent pandemic before COVID, and excess mortality was between about 30 and 50% in non-combatant European countries. So a lot lower than those more historic crises. And COVID mortality, excess mortality, was between 9 and 17% in the same countries that I have the results for the influenza pandemic for. So these were really big mortality crises. I just want to come back to the age pattern of deaths again. Most diseases, most epidemic diseases exacerbated the existing age structure of deaths. So we saw in COVID that older people were more vulnerable because they were usually more vulnerable, because they're always more vulnerable. But the 1918 flu was different. Most flu epidemics are also like that. It basically increases deaths proportionately for each age group. The 1918 flu was very different in that young adults, working age adults, had a larger proportionate increase in mortality than any other age group. And while I don't really dispute this in my research on the 1918 flu, I think it's often thought that actually it's a perception thing, that because young adults suffered so much, that those were the only people who suffered. But actually, infants also had an increased death rate, and older people also had an increased death rate. And I found that the ways that that infants were affected was not just through getting flu themselves and dying, but also through the illness and the death of their mothers, because this would make an infant much more vulnerable. It would mean that breastfeeding had to be curtailed, which would put infants at much greater risk of other forms of mortality and ill health. So you finished off by saying, what can we do about it? Well, I'm not quite sure what you're really after with that question. Luckily today, infant mortality is very rare, but I think we need to be aware of all of the other sorts of impacts on infants and children that epidemic and pandemic disease can have. And we saw some of those during COVID as well. So I'll finish there and allow you to move on to someone else.
Thanks a lot. It was really an interesting march through the centuries, also to give us an insight how strongly we have to differentiate, also demographically, different age groups and different effects of pandemics and crisis events, which might perhaps not be seen as a crisis. You just mentioned also the important role of perceptions. This is also a strong element which you can see, I think, in the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot was also more a matter of perception. And over the crisis, then it turned out that some things are less dangerous as people thought in the beginning. So we have really also to work on that, and particularly also on the situation situation of young people and how they are affected by this. The idea of perception, by the way, I wanted to invite, of course, our audience also to ask questions. You can use the Q&A button for that purpose, which you also can find at the bottom of your screen. The perception is also an important point of our cultural reactions to and anthropological reactions to crisis and excess mortality. And this allows me to hand over to go over to Sigrid Weigel. I switch back to German. Sigrid Weigel ist ehemalige Direktorin des Leibniz.
I'm switching to German now. Sigrid Weigel is a former director of the Leibniz Center for Literature and Cultural Research in Berlin and Professor Emeritus for Philosophy, Literature, Science and Technology History of the Technical University in Berlin. And the last thing shows her large breadth of topics she covers in research. Received 4 honorary doctorates at universities abroad and visiting professorial chairs in Princeton and Zurich. Ms. Weigel, many years ago, together with our former director in Rostock, Jürgen, we discussed epigenetic dimensions of longevity and mortality. The director of the Demographic Institute in Vienna, Mark Louis, emphasized in a presentation given not long ago that the personal crisis many German people experienced right after reunification, because they had lost their job and livelihood and didn't yet find their place in the new society, also had repercussions on their children. That is, we would basically, based on the experience of the parents, also experience one impact on life expectancy in the children. Now we also know of descendants of people who had very bad traumatic experience in the past, like in the Second World War, that also the children suffer from stress symptoms. Are such crisis experiences bequeathed? No, not in the biological sense. And before I directly answer your question, I would permit myself to talk a moment about the COVID crisis, because the crises you mentioned, namely the reunification and the after history of war and Holocaust, these are constellations that can teach us things about how to deal with the present. And what I found quite problematic right from the outset in this discourse and also in the way the COVID crisis was handled was that it was reduced to a medical definition of vulnerability. And this is also your aspect of the expansion to include cultural, or as I would say, socio-cultural aspects. The experts who reigned in this discourse were mostly virologists, epidemiologists. Hardly any social scientists and cultural scientists were involved. And for this reason, the perspective of a social mental vulnerability of younger people, of children and adolescents, but also of elderly people, has not been moved into the awareness of people at the beginning. Of course, at the beginning, there was quite a naive way of the idea of crisis. One thinks, okay, we need to think of policy management. After 3 months, everything will be over, and we can manage that with a few models. This somewhat naive way of dealing with this is actually a symptom of a lack of awareness of not knowing. That is, how do we deal with not knowing things as one possibility of facing crises in a different way? And this not knowing, this ignorance, also includes the inclusion of experience of earlier crises, or also experiences of violence, whether this is epidemics or experiences of violence. Now, to respond to your question, this expansion, and I call that transgenerational forwarding of crisis experience or passing on of such experience, also experience of violence, this can only be reduced if we don't reuse the phenomenon to biological and medical things. And this was the reason why I suggested at that time to set up a project for cultural demography. Cultural demography means, in particular, this passing on this forwarding to following generations to be included, and to take a look at how the experiences which are not becoming part of the immediate short-term dealing with crises still have an after effect. The most important textbook example is how the Holocaust and war were dealt with. Basically, it took 3 decades until medical specialists and psychoanalysts, therapists have understood that many symptoms of the second generation were symptoms of a transgenerational trauma. And for us, very little tangible symptoms came about. For example, therapists in Israel worked with children of survivors. Let me give you a very crass example. There was one son of survivors of the concentration camp who had severe impotency problems until it turned out that his father in the concentration camp was castrated without this father ever having talked about that. And through this silence and being silent about experience, despite that, memories are still alive and have an effect. And this is something we have to much more strongly integrate into our approach to crises. This not only means that the past is not something in the past, but that it lives in us. And the repetition of this overly optimistic attitude of responding to radical chasms in history, this is what we saw in 1989, the fall of the wall. The justified wish of people also after 45 to just enjoy life and go back to normality. This took revenge decades later, and I here think of the very strong abstract radicalization in 1968 and the following years, where the sons and daughters, basically, of the perpetrators repeated something just with the converse political signs, because the history was not repressed in their personal and family level, but on a very abstract level, like fascism as the high stage of capitalism, just giving you some of the slogans which led to such a radicalized attitude, which ranged up to this left-hand anti-Semitism we still have to struggle with today. So these are experiences we could benefit from if we reappraise them and deal with them. Basically, these repeated themselves in 1989, the fall of the wall, when there was talk only about building these thriving landscape, the formula Mr. Kohl used, the former chancellor. So this formula like growth only and connection to Western Germany in the positive sense, it was suggested to be that this could be reached without reappraising the experiences of the past, namely without reappraising what the experience of such connection to Western Germany meant for the population that had to endure this. And in my view, what we see today, namely this strong movement to the right and populism, these are exactly the consequences of insults and also the experience of having been thrown out of social contexts. And there's no influence on shaping and designing that, because suddenly, after two systems joined, only the criteria and laws of one system applied, which structurally had the effect that many who were not up to these criteria or did not want to abide by them, were dropouts. So the reappraisal of the years of the connection to Western Germany is still outstanding. What happened after 1989 was what the whole state security, the Stasi history was reappraised. But what we need today is, what I suggest is a peace commission, similarly to countries like South Africa, where not legally and economically things are repressed, but where people get the opportunity to, first of all, raise their voice and describe their experience, namely, how did they experience what happened to them in 1989? So as to your question, it's not bequeathed, but Sigmund Freud, who was the first one to theoreticize on this subject, used the term of archaic inheritance for that. And at that time, after the biology basically started to look into epigenetic processes, asked the question whether there might be something similar in our memories. And this is, of course, not just epigenetics in the biological sense. This means that besides the genetic processes, also through social, environmental things in the environment, certain genetic prerequisites are activated or not activated, but it is indeed a thing in the memories. The psychoanalytics describe that with the term of telescopage, of the moving into each other of the memories of different generations. And this image of telescopage really comes from the first descriptions of medical traumas after the train disasters, in railway disasters. The trains lie there in a deformed way, and this telescopage was then basically used as a metaphor to talk about what happened in a trauma in a transgenerational sense. That is a process that can be observed in the second and third generation of the survivors, as well as in the second and the third generation of perpetrators. So it's not just limited to the victims of the experience of violence, but also has something to do with how feelings of guilt or the displaced knowledge of any co-guilt or shame, feelings of shame which are squeezed off out of the mind, how this moves into the next generation without this being expressed. Or often it also is against the explicit narratives. This is a very important contribution. Cultural democracy is a term which inspired me, because I think this is a great, and it would be a great enrichment for demography, also in qualitative and cultural research, for aspects to be taken over by us. I mean, today we're in a situation where we observe that young people want children less and less, and we ask the question, why? On the one hand, it's the expectation regarding one's own individual life, which is perhaps or might be not so successful with children, but also the experience of crises and the endangerment of the world into which you give birth of a child. So we see that the perception of a crisis, which, like you said, is also translated from generation to the next generation as a narrative, how this then can also coin the demographic behavior. So it also links back to what Alice said, namely the importance of perception of child and infant mortality, which is also very much underestimated, as I think. But it's also in line with a very current development, namely climate change. It's also a kind of a crisis that becomes ever more visible, but it is also something threatening the life on the whole globe. Maybe at this point, Jürgen Renn, can I bring you into play? Can I also briefly introduce you? Jürgen Renn is the founding director of two Max Planck Institutes. In 1994, he was among the first directors of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. And since 2022, as I mentioned, of the new Max Planck Institute for Geoanthropology in Jena. He also holds honorary professorships in the history of science at Humboldt University to Berlin, and also the Free University in Berlin. His scientific achievements have been honored with many awards. He was a visiting professor at Tel Aviv University and the ETH Zurich, and is a member of several academies, including the Leopoldina. What has always impressed me is the way he constantly poses new and innovative questions, and this also applies to his current work. The new institute will focus on aspects of the Anthropocene, That is the phase in the development of the Earth system that is largely determined by human intervention and the technology we use. The disastrous thing about the climate crisis is that we experience other crises, such as a pandemic or an economic crash, very directly. So it's clear in these cases we need to act. There's no postponing. There must be a lockdown. The banking system must be reformed. But with the Earth system, it's developing differently, and various human intervention over the centuries are changing our system as a whole. Last year, a lake in Canada was declared an archive of the Anthropocene, so to speak, because we can trace these changes in the sediments. If I know correctly, you were involved, Jürgen, in this research group. So we know very well what we have to do, but one may as well find excuses because the climate change over an extended period of time as a crisis, which means may allow to embellish what one is doing and to postpone things into the eternity. Ms. Weigel also pointed to that. So many still believe everything works with technology and natural science, and mankind will find its way out because there are always natural disasters. We have always managed them. Jürgen, should we develop a new awareness of crises between alarmism on the one hand and realism on the other and fatalism on the other?
First of all, I would like to thank you, Andreas, for your question. Thank you also that you invited me to this very interesting panel. And in order to answer this question, I would like to come back to the COVID pandemic. A lot of things have been said in this respect already, but it's a very good lesson. You mentioned the climate crisis, but it's actually a much more comprehensive crisis. And the real essence of this crisis is the Anthropocene. On the one hand, this is the proposal for a new Earth age. You can use geological means, you can analyze and drill into the ground, and you will see that mankind has really become a geological power which left its traces in the ground. On the other hand, it's also part of the systematic research of the Earth. And we can see that it is a highly complex nonlinear system, which includes climate change, but also the biosphere, the loss of biodiversity, but it also includes the human society, and the crises of human society today are very hard to separate from this planetary crises, which actually are not nature-made. I mean, climate change is man-made, biodiversity crisis as well. So it's a system which is all intertwined. And you are right, it is very difficult to realize, it is difficult to understand for the individual, but it is not the case that slowly it's getting warmer like the tap water. No, you can really see it very dramatically in the events. We've got extreme weather conditions, which we experience in Germany as well as in other places of the world. So this is really a palpable symptom which is coming up along with this crisis. But as it's a multiple crisis, it's very difficult to handle. And now let me come back to my remark regarding the COVID pandemic and the lessons we could learn from it. I would even go that far to say that the COVID pandemic may be even a part of those multiple crises, because it's a zoonosis. It was spread from animals to mankind, maybe from wild animals to humans. And it's related to the fact that the use of land has restricted the life space of wild animals. And it doesn't actually matter whether it was spread from a laboratory or from a wild animal market. At least it is very closely related to the way how humans handle their nature or our nature, and it's related to the fact that we cannot isolate from the rest of the world. So the pandemic may be part of those multiple crises of the Anthropocene, and it was a normal crisis. Like the Anthropocene is a global crisis and brings about global crises. And what has our response been? Ms. Weigel has already pointed out very clearly and very impressively. On the one hand, it's a matter of natural sciences, where experts who deal with those questions were also addressed by politicians and by the general public. But what we miss to see is the comprehensive character and the necessary response to such a situation. In the COVID pandemic, we could see live on stage how scientists felt more and more the need to link with other experts, with epidemiologists, and finally also sociologists came in, Ms. Weigel. So it was at the end a very multiple concert, however, not well aligned with each other. I myself took part in some meetings of the Leopoldina Commission, and we could really see how how it was when several scientists have to deal with the same crisis from different perspectives. And that's also a lesson learned for the Anthropocene. Scientists are required in a much higher level to integrate apart from their individual disciplines, but across their disciplines, also including natural sciences and human sciences, coming together and trying to find answers and options for political and societal action. So a high level of integration of knowledge, which actually normally you don't find in this in science, which is more rather tending to be more specializing. And now all those different levels or types of knowledge about transformation, they all come in when we deal with questions of sustainability. But obviously, this is a societal learning curve which we still have to follow when we really want to face those challenges of multidimensional crises. There is something else which is striking in the COVID pandemic. Answers were mainly provided at the national level, whereas we had to deal with a global crisis, but it was really difficult to design any measures across national borders, and even less possible to implement them across national borders. Thank you. I did not want to interrupt you, but just think of how they dealt with the global south, how they dealt with the vaccines. And as a matter of fact, the global south was actually much more affected by the pandemic than Europe or North America. Whereas a global solidarity, which actually would have been required in such a crisis, did not come about in the way it would be wished. And when you come back to the climate change and other aspects of Anthropocene, it's also true that such challenges can only be mastered in a kind of global solidarity for especially, and unfortunately, the political and societal conditions are not really favorable to that. Anyway, it remains a clear lesson where what we can do in other areas, including science, namely by integrating the knowledge in a more broader way and in the discourse of the whole society. And that may be a specific lesson learned from this crisis. Isn't even, sorry?
Ich wollte noch einen Satz sagen, die Demographen haben ja schon darauf hingewiesen.
Demographers already pointed out, and I think it was you as well. Yes, unfortunately, there was some difficulty in the transmission part, but they pointed out already that some measures which were important for the healthcare system were already based on conclusions drawn in other pandemics. Astonishingly, they were really coming with a major delay of time, but I think there were still some positive consequences in how to deal with those crises. And if I got your question right, the science was in a crisis, if I got you right, and I think scientists perceived it the same way. As regards scientific organizations, that had some experience of deficits. For Leopoldina, that was a wake-up call indeed. We could see we are lacking institutions to coordinate all the knowledge and to put it together and translate it to an understandable language for society and politicians so that it becomes operable. Well, that is one important lesson learned from the pandemic, from myself as well, that we have to come together and interact much quicker between politicians and scientists. On the other hand, however, absolutely of your opinion, the national orientation of political measures, also in the political sphere, by finding out what's the virus like, what are the mechanisms of spreading, what can we do we have to do in order to avoid spreading. In that, has there been a global way of cooperation? Couldn't we, as scientists, also use that international networking, and so that we could also influence politicians in individual countries? I think that rather goes for science. However,
den wirtschaftlichen Umgang,
when it comes to the economic handling of vaccines, this is certainly not true, but it also tackles the questions for demographers. It's not only about the question of the measures.
was kann man eigentlich von gesellschaftlicher
What actually can we learn of societal comparatism that wasn't done in the necessary way?
könnte?
Those are also some lessons which one could learn, but only if you have this global view. And in order to come back to your initial question about creating a new consciousness for crisis, that needs to be a global one in the first place, because we are all sitting in the same boat, and we are so heterogeneous, so diverse as we are as mankind, but it doesn't change anything of the facts. And thinking globally and thinking about crises in a global way, that should be the new character of crisis management, which we have to find. Thank you very much. That is, there are lots of points for continuing. Alice,
the demography, and the other one that demographers should also deliver more also causalities maybe in such kind of situations, and contribute to understanding what a virus, what a crisis means for certain population groups. Would you agree to that? What is your take?
Sorry, can you just start at the beginning, because the translator was
talking. He was talking, okay.
Crossed over a bit.
Okay, so I wanted to link a little bit now, because demographers have been addressed twice. The first one was Sigrid Weigel's suggestion of a cultural demography, so to really get more of this cultural science, qualitative science approaches into what we do. And the other one was by Jürgen, that demographers should also be to contribute more actively in crisis situations to understand which groups are affected most, and also to the policy dialogue. What is your take on that? Can demography, could demography learn out of these?
Well, I mean, I think demographers don't just look at births and deaths and migration and so on. They also try to to bring in and understand which groups are most vulnerable, which how different groups are affected by different crises and so on. And I think demography has certainly a role in helping to understand and to suggest solutions for crises, particularly to understand why certain people are more vulnerable than others, or how those vulnerabilities interact, or how a disease and some other crisis interacts with circumstances, with existing vulnerabilities to exacerbate those, which is mostly the case. That the particular diseases don't just have a sort of the same effect on everybody. They may not be selective of particular people, but people's individual circumstances, what sort of job they have, how easy it is for them to work at home, what resources they have to be able to vaccinate, to get healthcare, or to shield themselves from other people, or whatever, can affect exposure and reactions to particular diseases. And this goes for all sorts of crises, and in the past as well as today. Although the way that actually produces an effect, of course, differs. And I think, the point about cultural demography is really, really important. As a historian, as someone who works on mostly historical demography, it's actually really difficult to get a handle on that beyond, if we go back beyond the 20th century, we're always using other variables, other indicators as sort of identifiers of culture to try to get to this issue of how culture can affect responses and reactions to crises and can affect different demographic behaviors, because it's very well established that cultural influences mold demographic behavior, particularly things like fertility and migration, as much as or more, perhaps more than mortality. So I think thinking about the way that culture happens and the way that cultural influences persist and produce demographic patterns across generations, as well as across space and time, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, thanks a lot. There's a question actually related to from the floor related to what you just said also a little bit. I have to read it. In terms of cultural demography, what is the impact of different types of crises on birth rates? For example, how would COVID affect the next generations? How different would its impact be from violence-related crises, such as wars, displacement, and so on? Are there any similarities between them? So here the question goes into more into fertility and different types of crises, which I think is very smart and very, very, very good question.
Absolutely, it's a great question, and there are, of course, we do see some impact of we saw some impact of COVID on birth rates. We saw a decline during the pandemic of conceptions, and then a recovery afterwards. Lots of people in the popular press said, oh, COVID's going to be associated with an increase in birth rates, and all the demographers said, no, COVID's going to be associated with a decrease in birth rates, partly because of things like there's a possibility that if people are ill, that they won't have so much intercourse, or that there may be an influence on miscarriages, and so the 1918 flu provoked a lot of miscarriages and stillbirths among women who were already pregnant. So there's both an effect on pregnancies which are in progress, and on pregnancies foregone by lack of opportunity, or through reduced conceptions because of uncertainty, because people, and I think that was the main thing during COVID, that people didn't really want to run the risk of bringing a child into the middle of a pandemic. And we saw that as well during the Zika pandemic in South America, that actually uncertainty reduced birth rates. There are some other sorts of crises which people can actually or people in the past have anticipated. So in previous centuries, when it was uncommon to restrict fertility during marriage, there is evidence that people did start restricting their fertility when they could see that the harvest was going to fail. And you can predict that well before the harvest by because you know that the rains haven't happened, you can see your crops not growing very well. And there's evidence that people started to put delayed births at those points in time as a sort of coping mechanism. Most of these are quite short-term effects, though, and people recover. I think there is a difference with the climate crisis, with the Anthropocene, in that that's creating a much longer period of uncertainty. And you can see, and perhaps economic crises happen the same way, but I think this sort of systemic uncertainty that we're moving into now is perhaps having quite a big effect on fertility. Of course, we don't really know how that's panning out. We can't really tell until the future. And it's quite difficult to identify effects across generations. But it's certainly a really interesting area of study.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I know that there are some research is done with fertility intention of young people and how they change, particularly in a crisis situation, and that they postpone, as you said, fertility, which then of course means maybe also less birth in the next generation, because simply less people are born and less mothers and fathers. So this has then effects which then at certain points in time then will show fluctuations in the fertility rate. So that's actually very interesting, and often we see what Jürgen also described. It's how important it is that scientists speak to policymakers about that, because very often there's a misunderstanding of the development of birth and fertility rates. So if there's a slight increase, then they celebrate that. Well, we did such a innovative family policy, and here you can see we are successful in creating more births, and the reality is actually different. It's really it has to be analyzed by demographers to give people really an understanding. What is it now? Is it tempo effect? What kind of situation do we have, and what kind of reaction do we need? I found all of your comments very encouraging, actually, to bridge not only between the world of practice and science, but also between cultural science and empirical science. As Jürgen pointed out, I mean, this is often also a matter of understanding each other, because we have completely different ideas of evidence. So if you talk to a lawyer, the idea of evidence, let's say on migration law, is a completely different one than if you talk to a demographer about migration. And so this is also really challenging us in view of next crisis, that the interaction among the disciplines, I think, should be improved a bit more. Perhaps we are running a bit short of time. Let me perhaps allow me to ask a question which again puts a little bit things into a longer perspective. Let me switch back to German. Es gibt einen deutschen Historiker, Winfried Schulze, der einer der großen Experten des 16.
There was a German historian, Winfried Schulze, of the 16th century, one of the big experts, and over the centuries, a lot of things, certainty have piled up. It started in Europe, and all of a sudden they could see there is a world outside as well. Global expansion started, and the framework of what you can experience has widened. The first demographer, John Watt, was a trader in London. His son worked for the East India Company, and all of a sudden in the next generation, a totally different world opened up, and the density of information increased. Communication, forms of communications, newspapers, etc. And Winfried Schulze said the 16th century at the end was mainly shaped by this overwhelming information, and so he proposed a countermeasure to control innovation again and to diffuse this. And that, of course, includes also the wars of the 17th century. And the whole 17th century was a very warlike century. And today people are talking about the same things. They say that in the face of polycrises, people are actually overwhelmed, and they are feeling uncertain, and that reflects in the birth rates, in the fertility rates, in international discourses. And are we maybe we are facing again a period of these overwhelming information, and what can we do against it? How shall we moderate the situation? Should we perhaps ask for less information? Ms. Weigel, I think you are wanting to take the floor. Well, overwhelming is evident, whether we look at it from the statistic point of view or from cultural sciences point of view. And it has a lot to do with the new social media, because people tend to confuse information and knowledge, and the speed and the sheer amount of information young people today are confronted with, while at the same time they are having the illusion that on this very small screen in front of you, you can really see the whole world. And in a certain way, you can also understand the whole world. That is actually the dilemma of this internet and the social media, which of course tend to overwhelm people. And in my opinion, that has something to do with the learning processes of technical developments in the past, that we have to find a way how to handle it, and we haven't long since not found it. And the whole discussion about AI is showing that. that we still are in the area of technical dreams of the people who really pushed for this the technical development. We can see this in the fact that a lot of technical developments, be it neural networks or artificial intelligence or the whole internet, those are all things which the California cybernetics already thought about in California as a dream, and what it became is actually becoming a nightmare for many of us. We are living in the materialized dreams of other previous generations, and that also affects the Anthropocene, that affects industrialization and the whole fascination for technical progress, whether it's a technological process or digital or just technical. There is always it's always a fascinating process, and only then consciousness comes in and the awareness of problems. And that becomes clear in all the scientific politics. The question of ambivalence is only seen as and treated as an estimate of the consequences of technology or as an accompanying process. There is some accompanying research of cultural scientists or other researchers, for instance, on robots. I have some knowledge about the questions of emotion detection in digital area, and there are some accompanying researchers by sociologists and social scientists. But what we have to learn is how much ethics and epistemology are interacting, and that ethics is not something which is just a philosophic discourse or moral discourse as an accompanying or science, or which even comes after it, but that already the theory of recognition is also having an ethic aspect, and that should be the basis for a much more integrative interdisciplinarity, not just the sum of knowledge from different areas which should be compiled, but already when we develop our questions, when we develop the research problems and research fields, we should be working integratively. From my own research in cooperation with biologists, natural scientists, physicians and others, it became more and more clear to me that a lot of empiric studies are incoherent when it comes when regards the question they are studying. There is always a gap, and this gap between the problems asked and the way how empiric research is being organized, that is something which can only be dealt with in an integrative approach. So I really plea so that people understand the interaction between epistemology, or let me say the question of epistemology is so basic, and it's really neglected in all those disciplines which only deal with their own aspects in their own discipline. And in universities, unfortunately, the study of natural sciences is more and more specialized. All the things which we once developed with regard to a general study or accompanying studies from the point of view of the history of science, it is all reduced since we started to introduce BA and MA. So the whole system of university study should be redeveloped from scratch. So you should remember that it is not about compiling points, but to make a problem, to make a certain problem, or to look at it from a more complicated or complex point of view. So we can actually not just deal with the problems we have in reality. The looking at problems from a more complex view requires a lot of patience and a dialogue between different disciplines. It starts already with the terms. That is why I once proposed an interdisciplinary history of terms. I'm referring to terms which are used in different disciplines in a very different way. For instance, the term of information is a role model as for this, because information in social sciences and cultural sciences means something totally different than in informatics. So there is a lot of work to do, but we have to tackle this, otherwise the future will running ahead of us. Well, actually, that would be a very beautiful closing remark. At least you mentioned a lot of things which are worthwhile to discuss it very much in length, especially the important subject of epistemology. I'm missing this in our own subject of demography. We do not speak enough about our own tradition, about the terms, what actually do we mean when we speak about family in certain cultural contexts. So that could be intensified, certainly. Now, of course, you mentioned technical dreams and technology, etc. Even though we are now exceeding a little bit our point, I can't really pass by Jürgen Renn because he's also researching in the technical field of. So very briefly, Jürgen, what is your take on that? In the meantime, I was lost due to my own technical equipment, but I'm back now, and I'm really grateful for Mrs. Weigel's word. It's very true. In many aspects, I agree fully with you, especially when it comes to linking epistemology and ethics and the importance of reflection, but not only from the outside, but also within science. And that starts during the studies. And it requires fundamental changes if you want to change structures. You can't just start at the level of research institutes or when you have to start interdisciplinary projects. It has to be included already in learning experience from the onset. But as time is almost over, I would like to just mention, you mentioned the technosphere. I mean, the man-made and infrastructure which has a planetary effect already by now. Sometimes also in system sciences, it is perceived like a self-organizing system, as if there had been such a certain autonomy where humans can only be part of the whole development and function and work like integrated circuits. And I think that has something to do with what Ms. Weigel has just said. What is the role of the internet and the links? I think I'm very optimistic. There is still room for maneuvering. We can design this. We can design technology so that it may serve our purposes. Some economic interests are against it, but this doesn't speak against changing it. And if we want to make the world a better place, we have to also use and perceive the opportunities which open up. Just utopias and dystopias are not everything. From the technical sphere, I would come back to an ergosphere to remind people that it's not an autonomous technology necessarily, but that we as humans really can still shape the future. That's just about my optimistic view. So we could really sit down and start a research project all together. It's really exciting. Thank you for all your great contributions. Unfortunately, I really regret it, but it was also really inspiring, and it is really a pleasure to speak to you and speak with you. Alice had to leave already because she's got another appointment. Thanks a lot. I'm really happy that we developed this cultural understanding of crises, that we also learned how demography could also be included in the future, but and how it can also affect demographic research, so that we should really think from the point of view of interdisciplinary research. And so for me, that was really a great inspiration. Thanks you for your contributions. Have a nice evening. And now we switch to the panel debate. Maybe that may be also interesting on the subject on how science and politics could interact in the possible next crisis. Thank you for being online and have a nice evening. Thank you.